"You'll birth me sons every year with that body," the mountain man declared to the obese virgin he found half frozen in the snow. But what began as a cruel, desperate boast in a storm-bound cabin becomes something no one could have foreseen. He's a scarred loner who buried his wife in these same mountains. She's a shamed woman, left to die by the man who promised her love. Now trapped together through the long frontier winter, their hearts thaw slower than the snow. When the thaw finally comes, a railroad agent rides in with papers claiming the mountain itself belongs to him, and the truth behind that claim could tear everything apart. As fire and betrayal sweep through the valley, one woman's faith may be the only thing that can save them both. Will mercy heal what vengeance destroyed? Or will the mountain claim another soul before love has its say? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Through the howling wind and stinging snow, Austin Boone trudged forward, his weathered hand gripping the lead rope of his pack mule. The beast's head hung low against the storm, steam rising from its nostrils in white puffs. The late afternoon sky had turned an angry gray, transforming the familiar San Juan Mountains into a maze of white shadows and treacherous drifts. Austin's muscles ached from fighting the wind. His beard was crusted with ice, and even through his thick buffalo coat, the cold bit deep. 20 years in these mountains had taught him to respect a storm like this. It was the kind that could freeze a man's blood before he knew he was lost. The mule suddenly jerked its head up, ears pricked forward. Austin squinted through the swirling snow, his hand instinctively moving to the Hawken rifle slung across his back. Then he saw it, a dark shape against the white, something that didn't belong. An overturned freight wagon lay half buried in a snowdrift, its canvas cover torn and flapping like a wounded bird. Austin's heart quickened. No one should be up this high with a storm coming in. "Whoa there," he murmured to the mule, securing it to a snow-laden pine. The wind howled louder as he approached the wagon, his boots crunching through the crusty snow. The track leading to it was already disappearing under fresh powder. He reached the wagon and peered inside. At first, all he saw were scattered crates and barrels, their contents frozen solid. Then movement caught his eye. A bundle of dark cloth shifted slightly. "Hello?" His voice was rough from disuse. "Anybody alive in there?" A weak moan answered him. Austin pulled himself closer, pushing aside a broken crate. There, wedged between barrels, lay a woman. She was curled tight against the cold, her dress soaked through with snow. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as the storm itself. In her trembling hands, she clutched a worn Bible close to her chest. Her eyes fluttered, open, glazed with cold and fear. Her lips moved, forming words he could barely hear. "Lord, have mercy." Austin didn't hesitate. "Ain't the Lord that found you, ma'am, but you'll freeze sure as sunrise if we don't move quick." He reached in, noting how the woman flinched at his touch. She was a large woman, soft and round, but the cold had made her weak as a newborn lamb. "Can't feel my feet," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Don't matter none right now." Austin wrapped his arms around her, grunting as he lifted her from the wagon. She was heavy, but he'd carried heavier loads in worse weather. "Got a cabin about a mile north. We'll get you warm." The woman's head lolled against his chest as he carried her through the deepening snow. Her Bible fell from her numb fingers, but Austin caught it with one hand, tucking it inside his coat. Something told him she'd want to keep it. His mule followed faithfully as they made their way through the white fury of the storm. Austin's muscles burned, but he kept moving, knowing that to stop was to die. The woman had grown quiet in his arms, Too quiet. "Stay with me," he growled, more command than request. "Ain't carried you this far to lose you now?" After what seemed like hours, the dark shape of his cabin emerged from the white void. Austin's hands were so cold he could barely work the door latch, but finally, they were inside. The cabin was cold and dark, but at least the wind couldn't reach them here. He laid the woman gently on his narrow bed, then moved quickly to the fireplace. His fingers, stiff with cold, fumbled with flint and steel until sparks caught the prepared tinder. Soon, a small flame flickered to life, hungry for the dry pine logs he fed it. The woman stirred, mumbling something he couldn't make out. Her dress was soaked through, the fabric starting to freeze. Austin knew what needed doing, but he hesitated. He'd been alone so long, the thought of touching a woman, even to save her life, made him uncomfortable. "Ma'am," he said gruffly, "that wet dress'll kill you sure as any bullet. Got to get you out of it." She didn't respond, lost in the grip of cold. Cursing under his breath, Austin pulled out his knife and carefully cut away the frozen fabric. He worked quickly, clinically, like skinning game. Beneath the dress, her skin was pale and mottled with cold, her underclothes just as wet as the rest. Once he had her free of the wet clothes, he wrapped her in his best buffalo robe, the one he'd tanned himself 3 winters ago. He added more logs to the fire until it roared, then set a pot of snow to melt for coffee. The woman's shivering gradually grew stronger. A good sign, though Austin knew the worst wasn't over. He'd seen men lost to the cold before, how they'd seemed to improve only to slip away in the night. He rummaged through his stores, finding dried meat and the last of his beans. As he worked, he kept glancing at her face, noting how the blue was slowly fading from her lips. She wasn't what most would call pretty, her features too plain, her form too substantial, but there was something about her that kept drawing his eye. The coffee began to boil. Austin poured some into his tin cup, adding a generous spoonful of honey he'd traded for in summer. He sat on the edge of the bed, lifting the woman's head. "You'll live, woman, if you eat," he growled, holding the cup to her lips. "Drink this first. Got some meat warming by the fire." Her eyes opened slightly, confusion and fear mixing in their depths. But she sipped the sweet coffee, color slowly returning to her cheeks. After a few moments, she managed to whisper, "Thank you for saving me." Austin just grunted, uncomfortable with gratitude. He busied himself with preparing the meat, aware of her eyes following his movements. The storm continued its assault outside, wind screaming through the pine trees and rattling the cabin's shutters. In the distance, wolves began to howl, their voices carrying clear and hungry through the night. The woman pulled the buffalo robe tighter around herself, her eyes growing heavy. Austin watched as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, her breathing finally steady and strong. In the firelight, with her face relaxed in sleep, she looked younger than he'd first thought. Maybe mid-20s, with skin that hadn't been too long in the mountain sun. He retrieved her Bible from his coat, placing it carefully beside her on the bed. The book was well worn, its pages marked with pressed flowers and written notes. A name was inscribed on the inside cover in careful script. Abigail Dunn. "Abigail?" he murmured, testing the name. It suited her somehow, solid and dignified, like the biblical women of old. Austin settled into his chair by the fire, rifle across his knees. The wolves were getting closer, drawn by the scent of human weakness. He'd stand watch through the night, making sure nothing troubled his unexpected guest's rest. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, his duty was clear. The fire crackled, throwing shadows on the log walls. Austin's thoughts drifted to another storm, years ago, when he couldn't save the ones who needed him most. He pushed the memory away, focusing instead on the steady sound of Abigail's breathing. Outside, the wolves continued their mournful chorus, but inside the cabin, a fragile peace held sway. The woman slept, the man watched, and the storm raged on, binding their fates together in ways neither could yet understand. As the night deepened, Austin found himself studying Abigail's face again. There was something about her, not beauty in the common way of thinking, but a kind of quiet strength that showed even in sleep. Her brow would furrow occasionally, and her lips would move in silent prayer or troubled dreams. Each time, Austin would add another log to the fire, as if the extra warmth might chase away whatever shadows plagued her rest. He'd found people in trouble before. These mountains were unforgiving to the unprepared. Usually he'd guide them to safety and be done with it, returning to his solitude without a backward glance. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the way she clutched that Bible, even in her half-frozen state. Maybe it was the gentle way she'd thanked him, when most would have been too afraid of his scarred face and gruff manner to speak at all. A particularly strong gust of wind rattled the cabin's door, making the fire dance. Abigail stirred, murmuring something that sounded like a prayer. Austin adjusted the buffalo robe around her shoulders, his calloused hands unusually gentle. "Rest easy," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "You're safe now." The wolves' cries grew closer, then faded again, like the ebb and flow of the storm itself. Austin kept his vigil, watching over the stranger who'd stumbled into his lonely world, wondering what story had brought her so far into these unforgiving mountains, and why the thought of her leaving in the morning left him feeling strangely hollow. Morning crept into the cabin, with pale fingers of light slipping through the shutters. The storm had settled into a steady whisper of snow, no longer the raging beast of the night before. Abigail stirred beneath the buffalo robe, her nose twitching at the rich aroma of coffee and something heartier, elk stew, bubbling in an iron pot over the fire. She blinked slowly, taking in her surroundings in the gray dawn light. The cabin was small but orderly, with dried herbs hanging from the rafters and neat stacks of firewood along one wall. Her rescuer sat on a wooden stool near the hearth, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel marking his progress as he sharpened a long hunting knife. Austin glanced up, catching her eye. "Sleep well?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Abigail pulled the robe tighter around her shoulders as she sat up. "Yes, thank you." Her clothes, she noticed, had been laid out near the fire to dry. "And thank you for saving my life." He grunted in response, testing his knife's edge with his thumb before setting it aside. Rising, he filled a tin cup with coffee and brought it to her, along with a bowl of the steaming stew. "Eat," he commanded, watching as she took the offerings with slightly trembling hands. "Need your strength up here." The coffee was strong and sweet, the stew rich with tender meat and wild onions. Abigail hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful touched her lips. She ate slowly, conscious of his eyes on her as he returned to his seat by the fire. "You're built for this country, woman," he said suddenly, his tone matter of fact. "You'll birth me sons every year with that body." The words hit her like a splash of cold water. Abigail stiffened, the spoon freezing halfway to her mouth. Her cheeks burned with a mixture of shame and anger, old hurts rising to the surface. She'd heard similar words before, always from men who saw her size as nothing more than a measure of her usefulness. "I'd sooner birth mercy than pride," she answered, her voice trembling but firm. She met his gaze steadily, though her heart hammered in her chest. Austin held her look for a long moment, then shrugged and rose to his feet. He limped to the pot, ladled another bowl of stew, and brought it to her without comment. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the storm's persistent rattling of the shutters and the crack and pop of the fire. As they ate, Abigail couldn't help but notice his limp growing more pronounced with each trip across the cabin floor. When he stumbled slightly while adding wood to the fire, she saw him wince, his hand going to his right thigh. "You're hurt," she said, setting aside her empty bowl. "It's nothing," he growled, but his face tightened with pain as he lowered himself back onto his stool. "Please," Abigail said, wrapping the buffalo robe around herself like a dress as she stood. "Let me help. It's the least I can do to repay your kindness." Austin stared at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he rolled up his pant leg, revealing a crude bandage stained with old blood. "Fell on some rocks a few months back," he muttered. "Never healed right." Abigail knelt beside him, her movements gentle as she unwrapped the bandage. The wound beneath was angry and red, showing signs of infection. "This needs proper cleaning," she said, looking up at him. "Do you have any spirits? Clean cloth?" He pointed to a cabinet near the bed. "Whiskey in there. Bandages, too." As she gathered the supplies, Austin spoke again, his voice so low she almost missed it. "Same pass where I found you. Different storm." He paused, his hands gripping his knees. "My wife. She was heavy with child. We got caught in a blizzard, trying to make it to town for the birthing." Abigail's hands stilled as she soaked a clean cloth with whiskey. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, understanding now the shadows that haunted his eyes. 3 years ago now," he continued, staring into the fire. I wasn't strong enough to save them both." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Abigail bowed her head, offering up a silent prayer for the woman she'd never meet, and the child who never drew breath. Then, with gentle hands, she began cleaning his wound, working carefully to cause as little pain as possible. Austin sat rigid, his jaw clenched as she worked. When she finished wrapping the clean bandage around his thigh, he caught her wrist. His grip was firm but not rough, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Why were you out there?" he asked. "In the storm?" Abigail pulled her hand away slowly, gathering the used bandages. "I was running," she admitted, moving to throw the soiled cloth into the fire. "From a man who thought much as you do, that my worth lay only in what my body could provide." The flames consumed the bandages, sending up a brief flare of light. In its glow, Abigail saw something shift in Austin's expression, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even shame. "I didn't mean," he started, then stopped, running a hand through his beard. "That was poorly said this morning. I'm not good with words anymore. Been alone too long, I reckon." "Words have power," Abigail said softly, returning to her place on the bed. "They can wound deeper than any knife, or heal what seems beyond mending." She picked up her Bible from where it lay beside the pillow, running her fingers over its worn cover. Austin watched her, his face thoughtful. "You sound like Sarah, my wife. She was always quoting scripture, finding hope in those pages." "Hope is never wasted," Abigail replied, meeting his eyes. "Even in our darkest moments." The storm continued its assault outside, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The tension from breakfast had eased, replaced by a fragile understanding. Austin rose carefully, testing his newly bandaged leg. "Thank you," he said gruffly, gesturing to his thigh. "It feels better already." Abigail nodded, pulling the buffalo robe closer as a draft crept under the door. She watched as Austin moved about the cabin, checking his supplies, adding wood to the fire, each movement measured and purposeful despite his limp. There was a grace to him, she realized, not in his words perhaps, but in the way he handled each task with care and attention. The morning wore on, marked by the slow brightening of light through the shutters and the gradual easing of the storm's fury. They spoke little, but the silence was no longer strained. Abigail found her clothes dry enough to dress, though Austin insisted she keep the buffalo robe wrapped around her shoulders. As she sat mending a tear in her dress with thread and needle borrowed from Austin's meager supplies, she caught him watching her several times. His expression was different now, less assessing, more wondering, as if seeing her truly for the first time. The wound in his leg seemed to pain him less as the morning progressed, though Abigail noticed he still favored it when walking. She said nothing, but resolved to check the bandage again before day's end. Some hurts, she knew, ran deeper than flesh, and needed more than just physical tending to heal. Outside, the storm continued its steady fall, keeping them both confined within the cabin's walls. Yet somehow, the space between them had grown both smaller and larger, smaller in the understanding that had begun to bridge their differences, larger in the respect that now colored their interactions. Abigail returned to her sewing, her fingers steady as she worked. She could feel the weight of Austin's unspoken apology in the way he moved quietly around her, in the extra log he added to the fire when she shivered, in the fresh cup of coffee he placed beside her without comment. Sometimes, she reflected, mercy came not in grand gestures or eloquent words, but in the small kindnesses exchanged between two wounded souls, each seeking their own path to healing. The storm rattled the shutters again, but its voice seemed less threatening now. In the comfortable silence of the cabin, Abigail offered up another prayer, not just for Austin's late wife and child, but for the man himself, carrying his grief like a physical burden. She prayed, too, for her own heart, that it might find the strength to offer understanding where once there had been only fear. The days melted together like snowflakes on warm glass as the storm kept Austin and Abigail confined to the cabin's four walls. The wind howled its lonely song outside, but inside, a quiet routine began to take shape. Abigail rose each morning before dawn, stoking the dying embers back to life, while Austin checked his leg wound. The infection was slowly retreating, but the old injury clearly pained him more than he would admit. She pretended not to notice how he gritted his teeth when rising from his chair, or the way his limp grew more pronounced with each passing day. On the third morning, while gathering snow to melt for washing, Abigail discovered a pile of torn shirts tucked away in a corner. Without comment, she threaded a needle and began mending the worn fabric, her stitches neat and even in the firelight. Austin watched her from across the room, his expression unreadable. "Ain't necessary," he muttered, but made no move to stop her. "These won't last another season without proper care," she replied simply, holding one up to show the frayed seams. "And I reckon you've better things to do than freeze." He grunted in response, but later that evening, she found more clothes placed quietly beside her bed, pants with torn knees, a jacket missing buttons, even worn socks that needed darning. The days fell into a pattern. While Abigail tended to domestic tasks, Austin struggled to maintain his usual routine. He chopped wood in shorter bursts now, each swing of the axe clearly costing him. More than once, she heard him stumble on the cabin steps, cursing under his breath. On the fourth day, Abigail found some dried apples in his stores and decided to attempt bread. The cabin's supplies were basic, but she had learned to make do with less in her years of keeping house. She mixed the rough flour with melted lard and the chopped fruit, working the dough with practiced hands. Austin's eyebrows rose at the smell of baking bread. "Been a while since I had anything but hardtack," he admitted, watching as she pulled the golden loaf from the crude oven. "Then you're long overdue," she said, cutting him a thick slice while it was still warm. He took a bite and closed his eyes briefly. "Reminds me of home," he said softly, then fell silent again. The storm showed no signs of weakening, trapping them in their shared solitude. Abigail continued her quiet work, washing what needed washing, mending what needed mending, cooking what meager meals she could from their limited stores. Austin's limp grew worse, despite her careful tending of his wound, forcing him to accept her help with tasks he would clearly rather handle alone. Their conversations remained hesitant, like winter birds testing frozen branches. Yet there was a growing kindness in their awkward exchanges, a careful consideration that hadn't existed in those first tense hours. On the 7th evening, as they shared a simple supper of beans and the last of her bread, Austin cleared his throat. "I'm much obliged," he said, staring into his bowl, "for all this. Didn't figure I'd see another winter through, truth be told." Abigail paused with her spoon halfway to her mouth. "Nor I," she replied softly, remembering the bitter cold of the overturned wagon, the certainty that death was near. They finished their meal in companionable silence, broken only by the familiar sounds of wind and crackling fire. But something had shifted with those simple words of gratitude. An acknowledgement of their shared vulnerability, perhaps, or recognition of how fate had thrown them together. The next morning, Abigail woke to an unusual brightness. The constant howl of wind had finally ceased, replaced by a profound stillness. Through gaps in the shutters, thin rays of sunlight painted golden stripes across the cabin floor. "Storm's broken," Austin announced, already pulling on his coat. He handed Abigail her now dry cloak, gesturing towards the door. "Might want to see this?" Together they stepped out onto the cabin's small porch. Abigail caught her breath at the sight before her. The world had been transformed into a glittering expanse of white, unbroken save for the dark shapes of pine trees heavy with snow. The morning sun turned every surface to diamond dust, almost too bright to look at directly. "I've never seen anything so beautiful," she whispered, pulling her cloak tighter against the cold. Austin nodded, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. "Gets awful quiet up here after a big storm," he said. After a moment, he added, "Haven't spoken to another soul in months before you came along. Sometimes I'd catch myself talking just to hear a human voice." Abigail turned to study his profile, seeing the loneliness etched there like weathering on stone. "God hears," she said gently, "even when we think we're speaking to empty air." He made a non-committal sound, but didn't argue the point. That evening, after they'd returned to the warmth of the cabin, Austin brought out his rifle. "Need to show you how to use this," he said, handling the weapon with familiar ease. "Wolves get bold this time of year, especially after a storm." "I've never fired a gun," Abigail admitted, eyeing the long barrel with apprehension. "No time like present to learn?" His hands were patient as he demonstrated how to load the powder, ram home the ball, and prime the pan. "Trick is to squeeze the trigger gentle-like, not pull it hard," he explained, watching as she practiced the motions. "And always keep the muzzle pointed away from anything you ain't planning to shoot." Abigail's hands shook slightly as she held the heavy weapon, but she forced herself to focus on his instructions. The rifle represented more than just protection. It was a gesture of trust, an acknowledgement that they were in this situation together. As she handed the rifle back, their fingers brushed briefly. Austin cleared his throat and stepped away, returning the weapon to its place by the door. "You'll get the hang of it," he said gruffly. "Just need practice." That night, as Abigail lay in her bed, Listening to the occasional crack of branches shedding their snow burden, she reflected on how much had changed in just a week. The man who had first carried her through the storm, bristling with distrust and barely concealed grief, had slowly revealed glimpses of a different nature, one capable of gratitude, consideration, and even gentle instruction. The cabin no longer felt like a prison of circumstance, but rather a sanctuary from the harsh world outside. In its confined space, two wounded souls had begun to find, if not healing, at least a kind of peace in shared solitude. Austin's soft snores from his bedroll near the fire provided a steady counterpoint to the night sounds outside. Abigail pulled her blankets closer, offering up a quiet prayer of thanks, not just for survival, but for the unexpected gift of understanding that had grown between them, as gradual and natural as the clearing of the storm. Outside, the night was crystal clear, stars pricking through the darkness like countless frozen tears. But inside the cabin, warmth held sway, not just from the banked fire, but from the tentative trust that had begun to bloom between two people who had expected to weather their storms alone. The morning dawned crisp and clear, a week after the storm had passed. Frost patterns decorated the cabin's small window panes like delicate lace, and the snow outside had settled into a thick, gleaming blanket. Austin stood at the door, studying the sky with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read nature's moods. "Weather's holding," he announced, turning to where Abigail was clearing away their breakfast dishes. "Need to make a run to Morgan's trading post. We're low on salt, and I've got pelts to trade." Abigail looked up from her work, hands still deep in the washing basin. "I'll come with you," she said, her tone leaving little room for argument. "We need more than just salt, and I'd rather choose the supplies myself." Austin's brow furrowed. "It's a fair distance through deep snow. Won't be an easy journey." "I'm not made of sugar," Abigail replied, drying her hands on her apron. "And I haven't survived this long by choosing the easy path." A ghost of a smile touched Austin's lips before vanishing. "Reckon not," he conceded. "Best get yourself bundled up proper then. Cold's fierce today." While Austin went to hitch the mule to his wooden sled, Abigail gathered what she needed for the journey. She layered her dried dress with his spare shirt and wrapped herself in 2 thick blankets, securing them with twine like a makeshift coat. Her belongings from the wagon wreck had been few, but she was grateful now for the woolen stockings she'd managed to save. Outside, the mule's breath rose in steamy clouds as Austin checked the harness straps. The animal's long ears twitched at Abigail's approach, but it stood patient and steady while Austin helped her settle onto the sled. He had arranged straw and an extra buffalo robe for seating, and Abigail found herself touched by this small consideration. They set out as the sun climbed above the mountain peaks. The sled's runners creaked through the snow, making a sound like distant violin strings. Around them, the forest was alive with winter music, the snap of frost-heavy branches, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the occasional cry of a jay. The mule's hooves made a steady rhythm, breaking trail through the pristine white. The smell of pine pitch hung sweet and sharp in the cold air. Abigail breathed deeply, savoring the clean scent. After weeks in the close confines of the cabin, the vast openness of the mountain landscape felt both frightening and exhilarating. She watched Austin's broad back as he led the mule, noting how he favored his injured leg, but refused to slow their pace. The journey took most of the morning. By the time Morgan's trading post came into view, a sturdy log structure with smoke rising from its stone chimney, Abigail's feet had gone numb despite the blankets. Austin helped her down from the sled, his hands strong and sure around her waist. For a moment, they stood close enough that she could see the ice crystals in his beard, but he stepped away quickly, turning to secure the mule. Inside the trading post, warmth from a pot-bellied stove wrapped around them like a blanket. The room smelled of tobacco, leather, and wood smoke. 3 trappers stood near the counter, their conversation dying as Abigail and Austin entered. Their eyes followed Abigail with undisguised curiosity. "Boone," one of them nodded to Austin. "Ain't seen you in a spell." Austin grunted in response, moving to speak with Morgan, the post's owner, about his pelts. Abigail kept her chin high as she heard one of the men whisper, "That's Boone's big woman?" She busied herself examining the post's goods, making mental calculations about what they could afford with Austin's pelts. Morgan was a fair trader, and Austin's furs brought a good price. Abigail selected salt, beans, coffee, and, after a moment's hesitation, a small packet of sugar. She could feel the trapper's stares as she conducted the transaction, but she handled it with quiet dignity, counting out the trade goods with careful precision. "Might get more snow tomorrow," Morgan commented as they prepared to leave. "Best make good time back." The return journey seemed longer. The sun had passed its peak, and shadows stretched blue across the snow. Austin's limp had grown more pronounced, though he said nothing about it. Abigail watched him struggle silently for a while before starting to sing, her clear voice rising above the creak of the sled runners. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." The old hymn seemed to float in the cold air, keeping time with the mule's steady pace. Austin didn't join in, but his shoulders relaxed slightly as she continued through the verses. When she finished, the silence felt somehow softer than before. They reached the cabin as the sun touched the western peaks, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold. While Austin tended to the mule and unloaded their supplies, Abigail set about preparing their evening meal. She had saved some of the morning's biscuits, and now she crumbled them into a pot with dried meat and the last of their previous stores of beans. The new supplies would wait for tomorrow. The cabin slowly filled with the rich smell of stew. Abigail had just stirred in a pinch of precious salt when she heard an unusual scraping sound from the corner where she slept. Looking up, she saw Austin had brought in several stripped pine logs and was fitting them together with practiced movements. "What are you making?" she asked, though she could begin to see the shape of it. "Proper bed frame," he answered without looking up. "Floor's too cold for sleeping, even with the buffalo robe." Abigail watched as his strong hands worked the wood, notching and fitting pieces together with careful precision. There was an almost tender quality to his movements, as if he were crafting something far more delicate than a simple bed frame. When he finished, the result was rough but sturdy, raised enough to keep her bedding off the cold floor. "Thank you," she said softly, running her hand along the smooth-planed wood. "You didn't have to do this." Austin straightened up slowly, favoring his bad leg. "If we're to last till thaw, might as well be comfortable," he said. Their eyes met briefly in the fading light, and something warm and uncertain passed between them before they both looked away. The stew was ready. Abigail ladled generous portions into their bowls while Austin lit the lamp, its gentle glow pushing back the gathering darkness. They ate in companionable silence, both perhaps thinking of the day's journey and what it meant. This first venture out together into the wider world, this small step towards something that felt almost like a shared life. Outside, the temperature dropped as night settled over the mountains. Inside, the cabin was warm with lamplight and the lingering smell of stew. Abigail's new bed frame stood in its corner, ready for the bedding, while Austin banked the fire for the night. Neither spoke of the way the trappers had stared, or of the hymn that had eased their journey home, or of the care that had gone into crafting a place for her to rest. Some things, Abigail was learning, were better expressed in actions than in words, in a steadying hand on a snowy path, in a song offered to ease another's pain, in the patient crafting of a gift meant to bring comfort. As she prepared for sleep, she said her usual prayers, adding a special word of thanks for the small mercies that made bearable these days of winter waiting. The March sun worked steadily at winter's hold on the mountain. Icicles along the cabin's eaves dripped steadily, their constant patter marking time like nature's own clock. The sound drew Abigail to the window, where she noticed dark patches appearing through the thinning snow. Spring was coming, slow but sure as sunrise. Austin stood in the doorway, frowning at the roof. "Need to check for leaks before the real thaw hits," he said, running a weathered hand along the doorframe. "Might need your help with that." Abigail nodded, already rolling up her sleeves. She had learned there was no such thing as men's work or women's work in the mountains. There was only what needed doing. Together they gathered tools, Austin's hammer, some spare shingles he'd split the previous fall, and lengths of twine for safety. The ladder creaked under their combined weight as Austin helped her onto the roof. The pitch wasn't steep, but the melting snow made the surface treacherous. Abigail crawled carefully on hands and knees, testing each shingle while Austin worked behind her, replacing any that felt loose. "Press here," he instructed, guiding her hand to hold a shingle in place while he hammered. His fingers were rough but careful against hers. They worked in comfortable silence, broken only by the tap of the hammer and the distant call of returning birds. By midday, the roof was sound. As they descended the ladder, Abigail's foot caught on a rung slick with snowmelt. She slipped, landing squarely in a patch of spring mud. The look of surprise on her face must have been something to behold, because Austin's laugh burst out sudden and deep, startling them both. Abigail blinked up at him, mud seeping cold through her skirts, and found herself laughing too. It felt good, like something frozen was finally thawing between them. Austin extended his hand, pulling her to her feet with gentle strength. "Reckon we should start on the garden next," he said, still smiling slightly. "Ground soft enough for early potatoes." They spent the afternoon clearing a patch of earth near the cabin. Austin worked the soil with a hoe while Abigail planted seed potatoes she'd saved from their winter stores. The dirt was rich and dark under the melting snow, promising life to come. Inside, she'd already started tomato seeds in tin cans along the windowsill. The cabin itself needed attention, too. Winter's close confinement had left it dusty and dim. Abigail threw open the shutters, letting in fresh air and pale spring sunshine. She beat rugs, scrubbed floors, and reorganized their meager supplies, while Austin repaired winter damage to the barn and chopping block. It felt almost normal, this shared rhythm of work and rest. Almost like a real home, Abigail thought, though she dared not speak it aloud. She was hanging fresh-washed curtains when the sound of hoofbeats made them both look up. A stranger approached on horseback, unusual enough this high in the mountains to put Austin instantly on alert. He moved to stand in the doorway, one hand near his rifle. The rider drew closer, revealing himself to be a well-dressed man in his 40s, his face reddened by sun and wind. A leather satchel was strapped to his saddle. "Afternoon?" the man called out, reining his horse to a stop. "Name's Clay Moran. I represent the Western Pacific Railroad Company." He dismounted with practiced ease, pulling papers from his satchel. "Need to discuss some business with you, Mr. Boone." Austin's expression hardened. "Ain't got no business with the railroad." "I'm afraid you do." Moran's smile didn't reach his eyes. "According to our surveys, this property falls within territory granted to the railroad by federal charter. I have the documents right here." He held out a thick envelope. "Just need your signature releasing any claim to the land." "This is my land," Austin growled. "Worked it 15 years. Got the deed to prove it." Moran's smile turned condescending. "I'm sure you believe that, Mr. Boone. But the railroad's grant predates any settler claims. Law is quite clear on this." Abigail had been watching silently, but something in Moran's manner made her step forward. "May I see those papers, Mr. Moran?" she asked politely. "My father was a clerk. I used to help him copy land grants." Moran hesitated, giving her a dismissive look that made her cheeks burn. But he handed over the documents with a shrug, clearly expecting her to be overwhelmed by the legal language. Abigail studied the papers carefully, remembering long hours spent at her father's desk. The format was familiar, but something wasn't right. The date stamp bore the wrong style for the year claimed, and the territorial seal showed wear patterns that didn't match its supposed age. She said nothing yet, but folded the papers carefully and handed them back. Moran tucked them away, looking impatient. "Well, Mr. Boone, will you sign the release, or do we need to involve the courts?" "Get off my land," Austin said quietly. The menace in his voice made even Moran step back. "Think carefully, Boone. Railroad's coming whether you like it or not. Better to take the compensation now than lose everything later." He mounted his horse, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "I'll be back in a week for your answer." They watched him ride away. When he was out of sight, Austin spat in the dirt and cursed under his breath. The peaceful mood of the morning was shattered. "That paper's false," Abigail said softly. "The date stamp and seal don't match what they should be for that year. I remember the proper forms clear. As day, my father was very particular about such things." Austin turned to her, surprise briefly replacing anger on his face. "You're certain?" "Yes. We should go to town, check the land office records. They'll have copies of the real railroad grants." "Town?" Austin's expression darkened again. "Those men there, the way they looked at you before." "Then they'll see I ain't weak anymore." Abigail squared her shoulders, lifting her chin. The woman who had arrived half frozen in a blizzard was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, tempered by mountain winters and honest work. "Truth's truth, Austin. Don't matter who speaks it." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll go tomorrow. Need to be sure about this." They returned to their tasks, but the easy peace of the morning was gone. Abigail could see tension in every line of Austin's body as he worked. She understood. This land was more than property to him. It held memories of his first wife, the child they'd lost, the life he'd built from nothing. And now some stranger with fraudulent papers thought to take it all away with a signature. The rest of the afternoon passed in uneasy quiet. Abigail finished cleaning the cabin while Austin chopped wood with fierce intensity, his axe biting deep into each log. The spring sun continued its work, melting snow and softening earth, unaware of the trouble brewing in the hearts of those who worked beneath it. That evening, as Abigail prepared their supper, she watched Austin cleaning his rifle with methodical care. The sight worried her. Violence wouldn't solve this problem, might even make it worse. But she held her peace for now, trusting in the truth she'd seen in those papers. Tomorrow they would seek proof, and justice would have to follow. Outside, the last light faded from the peaks. The drip of melting snow continued its steady rhythm, counting down the hours until morning. Change was coming to their mountain, faster than the turning of seasons. Abigail said her prayers that night with special fervor, asking for wisdom and strength for whatever lay ahead. Dawn painted the mountains gold as Austin led 2 saddled horses from the barn. The animals' breath steamed in the cool morning air, their hooves crunching on patches of lingering snow. He'd chosen his steadiest mare for Abigail, a gentle sorrel with white stockings and enough muscle to carry a full-grown woman over mountain trails. Inside the cabin, Abigail smoothed her clean calico dress with trembling hands. The fabric felt strange after months in wool and leather. She'd mended it carefully the night before, determined to face town with dignity. Her reflection in the small mirror showed a woman changed by mountain living. Cheeks ruddy from fresh air, hands strong from work, eyes clear with purpose. Austin waited by the horses, checking cinches and saddlebags. He'd strapped his rifle to his saddle and wore his good boots, though they couldn't hide his limp. When Abigail emerged from the cabin, he helped her mount without comment, his hand steady and respectful on her waist. The morning was bright and cool as they started down the trail. Spring had touched the lower slopes first. Patches of green grass pushed through melting snow, and early wildflowers dotted sunny spots with yellow and purple. The horses picked their way carefully over rocky ground, still soft from winter's grip. Abigail rode better than Austin expected, sitting straight in the saddle despite its unfamiliar motion. She'd tied her hair back neat and proper, though mountain breezes soon loosened stray strands around her face. They spoke little, saving their breath for the steep sections where the horses had to scramble over loose shale. By midday, they'd descended enough to find themselves among pine forests. The air grew warmer, thick with the scent of sun-warmed needles. They stopped to rest the horses near a small spring, sharing dried meat and hard biscuits from their saddlebags. 2 more hours to the river, Austin said, studying the sun's position. We'll camp there tonight. Reach Silvervale by tomorrow noon. He spoke matter-of-factly, but Abigail noticed how his fingers worried the frayed edge of his saddle blanket. They reached the river just as evening shadows lengthened across the valley. The water ran high with snowmelt, its rush drowning all other sounds. Austin chose a sheltered spot for their camp, where old cottonwoods offered protection from the wind. He worked efficiently, setting up a small tent for Abigail while she gathered firewood and started coffee in their battered pot. The familiar ritual of making camp eased some of the day's tension. As darkness settled, they sat beside the fire drinking coffee and watching sparks rise toward emerging stars. The horses dozed nearby, their shapes dark against the lighter sky. Sarah loved this spot, Austin said suddenly, his voice barely audible above the river's song. My first wife. We'd camp here sometimes, when we needed supplies. He stared into the fire, lost in memory. She helped build everything up there, the cabin, the garden, even dug the root cellar herself while I was out trapping. To lose it all now. Abigail set her cup down carefully. Faith isn't just about holding on, she said softly. Sometimes it's about letting go and starting again. Whatever happens in town, you won't face it alone. Austin looked at her then, firelight catching the silver in his beard. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. But he only nodded and turned back to the flames. They broke camp at first light, following the river valley toward Silvervale. As they rode, the trail widened into a proper road. They began passing other travelers, miners with loaded pack mules, farm wagons carrying early produce, a circuit-riding preacher on a spotted horse who tipped his hat politely. Silvervale announced itself first with noise. The clang of the stamp mill crushing ore, hammers ringing on anvils, the general din of a town swollen with silver fever. Then came the smell of coal smoke and unwashed bodies, so different from the clean mountain air they'd left behind. Finally, they crested a small rise and saw the town itself sprawled along the valley floor. False-fronted buildings lined the muddy main street. Wagons and horses crowded the hitching rails, while men hurried between the assay office, saloons, and general stores. A few women in town dresses picked their way carefully across wooden sidewalks, parasols held high against the noon sun. The stairs began as soon as they rode in. Men stopped their conversations to watch them pass. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Abigail felt every eye upon her, measuring and judging, but she kept her spine straight and her gaze forward. They had almost reached the feed store when a drunk staggered out of the saloon, pointing at them with exaggerated ceremony. "Well, if it ain't old Boone and his big ox," he called out, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Finally brought her to town to show her off, did you?" The words had barely left his mouth when Austin's fist connected with his jaw. The drunk went down hard, sprawling in the mud. Austin stood over him, hands clenched, ready to strike again. "Austin!" Abigail's voice cut through the sudden silence. She dismounted quickly, skirts rustling. "You fight too quick. Let me do it my way." He turned to her, chest heaving with anger, but something in her face made him step back. He gave a short nod, though his fists remained clenched at his sides. Abigail approached the fallen man, who was struggling to sit up, blood trickling from his split lip. She extended her hand to him, speaking clear enough for all to hear. "Sir, I forgive your poor manners, seeing as the drinks got hold of your tongue. But I reckon your mama taught you better than to mock God's creatures, big or small. Now will you let me help you up? Or would you rather wallow there in the mud?" The drunk stared at her outstretched hand, then at her face. Shame crept into his bleary eyes. After a long moment, he took her hand and let her help him to his feet. He muttered something that might have been an apology before stumbling away. A few onlookers nodded approval. Others turned away, disappointed at the lack of further violence. But Abigail had made her point. She would meet cruelty with dignity, not force. They stabled their horses and secured a small room above the feed store. It was spare but clean, with 2 narrow beds and a wash stand. The window looked out over the busy street below, so different from their quiet mountain valley. As evening approached, they sat together on a bench outside the store, watching the town's activity. Neither felt comfortable inside the crowded restaurant across the street. Instead, they shared bread and cheese from their saddlebags, planning tomorrow's visit to the land office. The Vios, strange sounds of town life surrounded them. Piano music from the saloon, horses' hooves on packed earth, fragments of conversation in a dozen languages. Austin's shoulders remained tense, his hand never far from his gun. But when Abigail began humming softly, the same hymn she'd sung during their supply run months ago, some of the strain left his face. They were no longer alone in their mountain sanctuary, yet somehow they felt less alone than ever. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight they had this bench, this moment of peace, and the quiet strength of knowing they faced whatever came together. Up in their rented room, Abigail laid out her father's old ledger and what she remembered about proper land grants. Austin cleaned his rifle, more from habit than necessity. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them had grown comfortable, like well-worn boots or a familiar trail. Through the window, they could see the last light fading from the mountain peaks they called home. Abigail said her evening prayers, adding a special word for the drunk who'd mocked her. Austin pretended not to listen, but his hands grew still on the rifle barrel. The town settled into its nighttime rhythm of saloon songs and muffled arguments, so different from their cabin's quiet, yet they would endure it. They had to. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, they had shelter, purpose, and each other's strength to lean on. Morning sunlight glinted off Silvervale's muddy streets as Abigail smoothed her dress and checked her hair one final time. The county clerk's office occupied the ground floor of a weathered brick building, its windows grimy with coal dust. Austin stood beside her, leaning heavily on his cane, his face set in grim lines. You sure about this? He asked quietly. Abigail nodded, squaring her shoulders. Some battles need a gentle hand, not a hard fist. She patted the leather satchel containing her father's old papers and the suspicious railroad grant. I'll manage fine. Austin's jaw worked, but he took up his post outside, positioning himself where he could watch through the window. His presence, even outside, gave her strength as she pulled open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the dim office. The room smelled of dust and old paper. Two clerks hunched over high desks, their shirt sleeves held up with garters. Neither looked up at her entrance. Abigail cleared her throat politely. Yes? The older clerk barely glanced at her, his pen scratching away. I need to verify a land grant, if you please. She kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered. The younger clerk finally looked up, his thin face creasing with disdain. Land office is down in Denver, ma'am. We don't handle such matters. But you do keep copies of all territorial grants, Abigail replied calmly. Section 12 of the Homestead Act requires it. And since the railroad's claim involves immediate settlement, surely you'd have the documentation here. Both men stared at her now. The older clerk removed his spectacles, frowning. And how would a woman know about homestead law? My father was county recorder back in Missouri. Abigail opened her satchel, laying out the railroad grant. He taught me well enough to spot irregular seals and impossible dates. The younger clerk's face reddened. Now see here. Is there a problem? A new voice cut through the tension. Marshal Harlan Tate stood in the doorway, his badge catching the morning light. He walked with a pronounced limp, but his eyes were sharp under the brim of his hat. No problem, Marshal, the older clerk said quickly. Just explaining to this lady that we don't handle land matters. Actually, Abigail said, turning to include the marshal, I was pointing out that this railroad grant is dated 1873, but bears a territorial seal that wasn't used until 1875. She traced the seal with one finger. See how the eagle faces left instead of a right? And the paper itself. She held it up to the light. No watermark. All territorial grants after 1872 required the double eagle watermark. The marshal stepped closer, studying the document. His weathered face gave nothing away, but his eyes narrowed slightly. That's mighty specific knowledge, ma'am. My father believed in teaching his children their letters and their laws. Abigail met his gaze steadily, especially when those laws protect honest folk from theft. Marshal Tate was silent for a long moment. Finally, he turned to the clerks. I believe this deserves investigation. Gather every railroad grant filed in the last 6 months. We'll review them all. His tone left no room for argument. The younger clerk started to protest, but the marshal's hard stare silenced him. Both men grudgingly began pulling files from the shelves. Outside, Austin hadn't moved from his post, but when Abigail emerged into the sunlight, she saw pride flickering in his eyes. You handled them men better than any bullet, he said quietly. Abigail felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. Truth speaks louder than violence if we've ears to hear it. They spent the afternoon reviewing documents with Marshal Tate, Abigail's trained eye catching more irregularities. The marshal's frown deepened with each discovery. By evening, he had enough evidence to suspend all railroad claims pending further investigation. As they left the office, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Church bells rang out across town, calling people to Sunday service. Reckon we ought to go, Abigail said softly. Give thanks for justice done right. Austin hesitated, but nodded. They walked slowly to the small white church at the edge of town, his cane tapping against the wooden sidewalk. Inside, oil lamps cast a warm glow over rough-hewn pews. The congregation was small, mostly miners' wives and a few old-timers. They drew some curious glances, but no one spoke. Reverend Grant stood at the pulpit, his Bible worn and well-loved. His sermon focused on mercy's victory over might, drawing from the story of David sparing Saul in the wilderness. "When we choose mercy," he said, his voice carrying to the rafters, "we show God's strength more surely than any weapon could prove." Abigail hummed along with the familiar hymns, her clear voice joining the others in praise. Beside her, Austin stood silent, his face shadowed. She noticed his hands gripping his cane tightly during prayers, as if wrestling with something inside himself. When they sang Amazing Grace, Abigail saw him close his eyes, perhaps remembering other Sundays, another woman's voice raised in worship. She touched his arm gently, offering comfort without words. The service ended with a prayer for peace in the territory. As people filed out into the gathering dusk, Reverend Grant stopped them briefly. "Good to see new faces," he said, his kind eyes taking in Austin's tension and Abigail's quiet strength. "Remember, God's mercy makes room for all his children, no matter their burdens." Austin nodded stiffly, but Abigail saw something ease in his bearing as they walked back to their room above the feed store. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains. Their mountain, still waiting, still home. Tomorrow would bring more battles with railroad men and forged papers. But tonight, they had won a victory for truth, not violence. And in the space between justice and mercy, something was growing, a partnership of equals, each bringing their own strength to the fight. Marshal Tate's investigation would take time. They would need to stay in town a while longer, far from their quiet cabin. But as Abigail looked at Austin's profile in the fading light, she knew they would face whatever came together, her wisdom tempering his strength, his courage supporting her truth. The town settled around them, Sunday quiet broken only by distant piano music and the evening stage rolling in. Above, stars began to appear, the same stars that watched over their mountain valley. Different paths had brought them here, hers marked by shame turned to purpose, his by grief transformed through grace. Yet somehow those paths had joined, leading them toward something neither had expected to find. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, they had this moment of peace, earned through truth and mercy rather than force. And that, Abigail thought, was worth more than any gold in Silvervale's mines. The morning sun cast long shadows across Silvervale's muddy street when the rider approached. His horse's hooves splashed through puddles left by the previous night's rain, breaking the quiet of the sleepy mining town. Austin and Abigail were just leaving the general store, arms full of supplies for their return to the cabin, when the man dismounted nearby. "Mr. Boone?" The rider, a young telegraph operator from Denver, pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Marshal Tate asked me to deliver this straight away." Austin shifted his packages to one arm, taking the message with his free hand. Abigail watched his face as he read, noting how the color drained from his weathered cheeks. His hands began to shake, and the packages slipped from his grasp, spilling flour and coffee across the wooden sidewalk. "Austin?" Abigail touched his arm gently. "What is it?" He crumpled the paper in his fist, his knuckles white with tension. "Luke," he growled, the name coming out like poison. "It's Luke behind all this." "Luke?" Abigail remembered him mentioning a brother once, late at night by the cabin fire, but he'd changed the subject quickly. Austin's face twisted with fury. Without warning, he wheeled around and slammed his fist into the store's outer wall. The wooden planks shuddered from the impact. Blood appeared on his knuckles, but he seemed not to notice. "Austin, stop!" Abigail grabbed his arm before he could strike again. "You're hurting yourself." He yanked away from her, pacing like a caged animal. Several townspeople stopped to stare, but Abigail's stern glance sent them hurrying along their way. The young telegraph operator had already disappeared, clearly wanting no part of the drama unfolding. "My own brother," Austin spat the words. "My flesh and blood trying to steal my land." He let out a harsh laugh that held no humor. "Though he made it clear enough years ago that we weren't brothers anymore." Abigail bent to gather the spilled supplies, giving him a moment to collect himself. When she straightened, his breathing had steadied somewhat, though rage still burned in his eyes. "What happened between you?" she asked softly. Austin leaned against the wall, his injured hand leaving a bloody smear on the wood. "I married a Ute woman," he said finally. "Sarah Two Rivers. Luke couldn't stomach it. Said I was betraying our family, mixing blood with savages." His voice broke on the last word. "He disowned me right there. Said he never wanted to see me again." "And Sarah?" Abigail already suspected the answer, remembering his earlier mention of a wife lost in the pass. "Died in childbirth 3 years later. Her and our boy both." Austin's words were barely audible. "Luke never even wrote when I sent word. Now he shows up with forged papers, thinking to take everything she helped build." Abigail saw his hands clench again, knew he was imagining violence. "Austin," she said firmly, "don't meet hate with hate. It won't honor Sarah's memory." "What would you have me do?" he demanded. "Let him steal my land? Let him win?" "We'll fight him with truth and law," Abigail replied. "Like we've been doing. Violence will only prove him right about you." But Austin was already striding away, his uneven gait made worse by anger. Abigail called after him, but he disappeared around the corner toward the livery stable. She knew where he was headed. The saloon next door kept a barrel of whiskey for the stable hands. With a heavy sigh, she gathered their supplies and carried them back to their rented room above the feed store. The afternoon light faded into evening, then full dark, but Austin didn't return. Through the window, she could see the glow of lanterns in the livery stable where he sat drinking, a solitary shadow among the horses. Abigail lit their room's oil lamp and opened her Bible. Her father had always said Scripture could reach troubled hearts, even from a distance. In a clear voice, she began to read aloud. "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink." Her voice carried through the open window, floating on the night air. Hours passed. She read psalm after psalm, pausing only to trim the lamp wick or sip from a cup of water. Her throat grew hoarse, but she continued, hoping her words might reach him through his dark thoughts. "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." Near midnight, someone in the street below called out, "Quiet up there." But Abigail kept reading. The stars wheeled overhead, and still she read, her voice growing softer but never stopping. It was almost dawn when she heard his heavy step on the stairs. The door creaked open, and Austin stood swaying in the threshold, smelling of whiskey and shame. His bloodshot eyes met hers briefly before dropping to the floor. "Been reading all night?" he asked roughly. "Seemed like you needed to hear it," she replied, marking her place with a ribbon. He slumped onto his cot without removing his boots. "Didn't solve nothing." "Wasn't meant to solve," Abigail said quietly. "Just meant to remind you you're not alone in this fight." Austin was silent for a long moment. Finally, he muttered, "We should head back to the cabin. Storm's coming." He was right. Abigail could smell snow on the wind through the window. They packed their supplies in silence as the first pale light crept over the mountains. The streets were empty when they led their horses out of the livery, save for a few early-rising miners heading to their claims. The ride home was heavy with unspoken words. Austin's shoulders remained tense, his jaw clenched against whatever demons still haunted him. Abigail let him brood, knowing some battles had to be fought in the heart before they could be won in the world. Snow began falling as they climbed higher into the mountains, delicate flurries that danced in the morning light. The flakes caught in Abigail's hair and eyelashes, reminding her of that first desperate night when Austin had found her in the overturned wagon. So much had changed since then, yet here they were again, riding through falling snow with uncertainty ahead. Their horses' hooves crunched through patches of lingering winter ice. The morning grew colder as they gained elevation, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The snow fell harder, cutting visibility to a few dozen yards ahead. Still, they rode on in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Abigail worried about what would happen when Luke finally showed his face. Would Austin's rage overwhelm his reason? Would blood prove thicker than water? Or would old wounds drive the brothers to violence? She looked at Austin's broad back, noting how his shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. He carried such weight, grief for his lost family, betrayal by his brother, and now this threat to his land. Yet she had seen glimpses of the good man beneath the pain, the one who had saved her life and offered her shelter without expecting anything in return. The snow continued to fall as they made their way home, each flake a reminder that nature cared nothing for human disputes. The mountains would endure, regardless of who owned the paper claiming their slopes. What mattered was the truth in their hearts and the strength to face whatever came next. As they approached the cabin, Abigail whispered a prayer for wisdom and grace in the days ahead. They would need both to face Luke Boone and whatever schemes he had planned. But for now, there was only the sound of snow falling on pine needles, horses' hooves on frozen ground, and the weight of unspoken fears between them. The journey home stretched longer than usual. Austin's horse plodded behind Abigail's, his usual sure command of the reins absent as he nursed his whiskey-soaked head. The morning sun, though weak through the snowfall, seemed to pain him. Every few minutes, he would squeeze his eyes shut and sway slightly in the saddle. Abigail kept watch from the corner of her eye, noting how his face had gone gray beneath his weathered tan. When his horse stumbled on a patch of ice, and Austin barely corrected in time, she knew they couldn't make it home in one push. "We need to make camp," she announced, reining her horse toward a sheltered hollow. "The horses are tired." Austin didn't argue, a sure sign of how poorly he felt. He dismounted clumsily, stumbling as his boots hit the ground. Abigail was there in an instant, steadying him with a firm grip on his arm. "I ain't dying," he muttered, but his skin felt hot even through his coat sleeve. "No, but you've got yourself a fever to go with that hangover." Abigail guided him to sit on a fallen log while she set up camp. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, gathering dry wood from beneath snow-laden branches and clearing a space for the fire. Austin watched through half-closed eyes as she worked. "Shouldn't be you doing all this," he said hoarsely. "Hush now." Abigail got the fire started and spread their bedrolls near its warmth. She melted snow in their coffee pot and mixed in dried willow bark from her medicine pouch, an old remedy her mother had taught her for fever and aches. When the bitter tea was ready, she pressed the tin cup into Austin's shaking hands. "Drink it all," she instructed. "It'll help with the fever." He grimaced at the taste, but drank obediently. Abigail noticed how his hands trembled, how his shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. The proud mountain man looked suddenly old and vulnerable in the fading light. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out rough and raw. "For drinking. For running off like some fool kid instead of facing things proper." Abigail sat beside him on the log. "You had cause to be upset." "Not cause to shame myself? Or worry you?" He stared into the fire, his profile sharp against the flames. "Ain't been much of a Christian example lately." "The Lord knows our hearts," Abigail said softly. "Even when we lose our way for a spell." Austin's chin dropped to his chest, and she saw him shiver. Without thinking, she reached out and brushed the sweat-dampened hair back from his forehead. His skin burned against her palm, but he leaned into her touch like a tired child. "You need rest," she said. "The fever won't break if you don't sleep." He let her help him to his bedroll, too sick to protest when she covered him with both their blankets. Throughout the night, she kept the fire fed and bathed his face with snow-cooled cloths, singing hymns under her breath when he grew restless. Dawn broke clear and cold. Austin's fever had broken in the night, leaving him weak but clear-headed. They ate a simple breakfast of jerky and hard tack before breaking camp. The rest of the journey passed in comfortable quiet, broken only by the crunch of hooves on snow and the occasional cry of a circling hawk. When they finally crested the last ridge, their valley spread below them like a promise. The afternoon sun had begun to work its spring magic, releasing the scent of thawing pine from the needles and warming the earth enough that patches of grass showed through the melting snow. Abigail breathed deeply, savoring the clean smell of coming spring. After the tension of town, the valley felt like sanctuary. Even Austin sat straighter in his saddle as they approached the cabin. The next days fell into a rhythm. Abigail returned to the familiar tasks that had become her domain: cooking hearty meals, keeping the cabin clean, and planting rows of spring onions in the slowly thawing earth. She hummed as she worked, old hymns mixing with the bird song that had returned to their valley. Austin, still carrying the weight of his guilt, threw himself into dawn-to-dusk labor. He rebuilt the winter-damaged fences with single-minded focus, replacing rotted posts and mending broken rails until his hands were raw and blistered. Though they shared meals and evening fires, they spoke little. Yet the silence between them had changed, softened somehow by shared understanding. One evening, as Abigail sat darning socks by lamplight, distant lightning flickered across the peaks. The spring storm was still far off, but its promise hung in the air like possibility. Austin paused in his whittling and looked at her, something uncertain in his expression. "Been thinking," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "If you still want to stay come summer, I'll build you a house of your own, something proper, with glass windows and a root cellar. Give you your independence." Abigail's hands stilled on her mending. She looked at him, really looked at the man who had saved her life that winter night, who had opened his home, and slowly, carefully, his heart. She saw the worry in his eyes, the fear of rejection warring with hope. "I'd rather build one together," she said simply. The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned as the lightning on the horizon. Austin's eyes met hers, and in them she saw understanding dawn like sunrise. They had both been alone too long, carrying their separate burdens of grief and shame. Perhaps it was time to build something new, not just of logs and nails, but of shared faith and mutual trust. The storm drew closer, but inside the cabin, warmth bloomed like spring flowers through mountain snow. They returned to their quiet tasks, him whittling, her mending, but something had shifted, settled into place like the final piece of a long-worked puzzle. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and renewal. Inside, two souls who had found each other in winter's darkest hour began to imagine summer's possibilities, one shared breath at a time. The morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect late spring day in the high country. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's small window, catching dust motes that danced in the air as Abigail smoothed her blue calico dress with trembling hands. She'd spent weeks carefully mending and altering it, letting out seams and adding careful touches of white lace at collar and cuffs. The dress wasn't new, but like her heart, it felt renewed by patient attention and hope. Outside, she could hear Austin moving about, his footsteps different today, lighter somehow despite his lingering limp. The sound of splashing water and muttered words told her he was washing up by the rain barrel, taking extra care with his appearance. A smile touched her lips as she remembered his determination yesterday to give himself a proper shave for their wedding day. Wedding day. The words still felt strange, like a dream she might wake from at any moment. Yet the simple gold band Austin had traded 4 prime beaver pelts for sat real and solid on her dresser, catching the morning light. She pinned her hair carefully, the way her mother had taught her years ago, weaving the thick brown strands into a crown around her head. No fancy veil or orange blossoms, but she had tucked a sprig of wild mountain laurel behind her ear, a touch of beauty for this most precious day. A knock at the door startled her. "You decent?" Austin called, his voice gruff with awkward emotion. "Come in," she answered, turning to face him. Austin stood in the doorway, transformed by his efforts at grooming. His usually wild beard was trimmed neat, his sun-weathered face freshly shaved except for his mustache. He'd put on his best buckskins, cleaned and oiled until they gleamed like honey in the morning light. In his hands, he held a bouquet of wildflowers, columbine and Indian paintbrush gathered from the meadow, their colors bright against his calloused fingers. "You look," he started, then stopped, his eyes taking in her transformed appearance. "Like an angel," he finished softly. Abigail felt her cheeks warm. "And you look very fine yourself, Mr. Boone." He crossed to her in 3 quick strides, holding out the flowers like an offering. "Ain't much, compared to what town ladies might have, but—" "They're perfect," she interrupted, bringing the blooms to her face and breathing in their sweet mountain scent. "Just perfect." They stood for a moment, shy as courting youngsters despite the months of shared life between them. Finally, Austin cleared his throat. "Horses are saddled. Old Joe and Sarah Walking Star said they'd meet us at the chapel." The tiny log chapel sat 2 hours' ride away, tucked into a sheltered valley where several homesteads clustered close enough to support monthly visits from a circuit-riding preacher. As they rode, the spring morning opened around them like a blessing. Meadowlarks trilled from fence posts, and fresh grass sparkled with dew beneath their horses' hooves. Abigail found herself studying Austin's profile as they rode, marveling at how life could change so completely. 6 months ago, she'd been half frozen in a snowbank, certain death had finally come to claim her after all her failures. Now here she was, riding toward a future she'd stopped believing possible. "Penny for your thoughts," Austin said, catching her gaze. "Just thinking how the Lord works in mysterious ways," she answered honestly. "How sometimes what looks like the end of everything turns out to be just the beginning." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. They'd both known that kind of despair, that kind of redemption. The chapel came into view around mid-morning, sunlight gleaming on its small cross. Outside, old Joe Thompson, a grizzled trapper who'd known Austin for years, waited with his wife, Sarah Walking Star. The Navajo woman's dark eyes crinkled with warmth as she embraced Abigail. "Welcome, sister," she said in her soft, accented English. "The Holy One smiles on this day." Old Joe clapped Austin on the shoulder. "About time you found yourself some happiness, boy." Inside, the chapel was cool and dim, smelling of pine wood and yesterday's flowers. Reverend Matthews, the circuit preacher, stood ready at the simple altar. He was a practical man who understood mountain folk, and his sermon was as straightforward as his weathered face. "Love," he began, looking at the small gathering, "is not beauty seen, but mercy practiced. It's not the face that catches the eye, but the hand that reaches out in the dark. It's not the perfect match of two hearts, but the perfect willingness to carry each other's burdens." Abigail felt tears prick her eyes as the preacher's words wrapped around her heart. Beside her, Austin stood tall and steady, his hand finding hers as they faced each other for their vows. "I, Austin Boone, take thee, Abigail Dunn." His voice was rough with emotion, but sure as he spoke, the ancient words. Abigail's own voice trembled but held strong as she made her promises in return. The gold band slid onto her finger, warm from Austin's pocket. Sarah Walking Star's soft singing filled the chapel, an old hymn in her native tongue that spoke of beauty rising from ashes, of love stronger than winter storms. Old Joe signed the marriage certificate with a flourish, and Sarah added her precise X, making it legal in the eyes of both God and man. The ride home seemed shorter somehow, the afternoon light painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. They spoke little, but their silence was full of quiet joy. Austin's horse kept pace with hers, their shoulders sometimes brushing as they rode side by side along the familiar trail. When they reached the cabin, the sun was setting in earnest, painting the sky in shades of pink that seemed to bless their homecoming. Austin dismounted first, then turned to help Abigail down. But instead of letting her feet touch earth, he gathered her into his arms. "Reckon we ought to do this proper," he said, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes as he carried her toward the cabin door. Abigail laughed as he maneuvered them somewhat awkwardly through the doorframe, careful not to bump her head. "Land's sake, Austin Boone, I'm not exactly light as a feather." "You're exactly what you ought to be," he answered, setting her gently on her feet inside their home. "Strong enough to weather anything life throws at us." The cabin looked different somehow, transformed by fresh swept floors, new curtains Abigail had sewn, and a vase of wildflowers on the table. The fire was already laid, needing only a match to spring to life. Together they moved through the familiar routine of ending a day, hanging up coats, bringing in fresh water, lighting the lamps as evening deepened outside their windows. Abigail warmed up the wedding supper she'd prepared yesterday, venison stew, cornbread, and a special apple pie made with dried fruit they'd been saving. They sat at their table, now man and wife, sharing quiet laughter and simple food made special by the occasion. As the last of the twilight faded outside, Austin reached across the table to trace the lines of her hand, his finger lingering on the gold band that marked their union. "Guess God knew what he was doing in that snowstorm," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers with tender certainty. Abigail turned her hand to clasp his, feeling the strength and gentleness in his grip. "He surely did," she answered. "He surely did." The evening wrapped around them like a blanket, full of quiet joy and answered prayers. Outside their window, the first stars began to appear, bright as promise in the mountain sky. Inside, two hearts that had once been broken found themselves mended by love's tender mercies, stronger at the broken places for having found each other in the midst of life's storms. The mountain summer settled into gentle rhythms for Austin and Abigail Boone. Each morning brought its own quiet symphony, coffee brewing on the cook stove, birds greeting the dawn, and the soft sounds of two people moving in comfortable harmony through shared space. Their cabin had transformed from Austin's solitary shelter into a true home, filled with the warmth of partnership and shared purpose. Abigail rose early most days, padding barefoot across clean-swept floors to start breakfast, while Austin tended to the horses and mules. She'd learned to gauge his morning mood by the way he closed the cabin door. A firm snap meant good hunting weather. A gentle push suggested storms on the horizon. Today, the door whispered shut behind him, and she smiled, knowing he'd spotted clear skies. The garden flourished under Abigail's careful attention. She'd carved out a patch of earth near the cabin's southern wall, where tender shoots reached toward mountain sunlight. Rows of potatoes pushed through dark soil, their leaves a promising green. Peas climbed makeshift trellises Austin had fashioned from spare lumber, and hardy mountain lettuce spread its leaves wide. She'd even managed to coax a few tomato plants to life, though Austin swore they'd never ripen in the short growing season. "Them's lowland vegetables," he'd tease as she fussed over the plants each morning. "Built delicate, like townfolk." "Just you wait," she'd reply, her hands gentle on the green stems. "They'll surprise you yet." Their gentle bickering had become its own kind of music, a far cry from the tense silence of their first days together. Austin still spoke sparingly, but his words carried warmth now, and his eyes often held laughter when he watched her work. One bright morning, as Abigail knelt in her garden pulling weeds, Austin paused in his work to study her. She'd tied her hair back with a faded ribbon, and her face glowed with perspiration and purpose. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "might be time to think about building proper-like. This cabin's snug enough, but with winter coming—" He trailed off, his meaning clear in the slight color that rose to his cheeks. Abigail sat back on her heels, brushed the dirt from her hands. "Are you saying what I think you're saying, Austin Boone?" He shifted his weight, suddenly fascinated by the axe handle in his hands. "Well, if the Lord sees fit to bless us with little ones, we'll need more room. Thought maybe we could start on a proper house come autumn. 2 stories maybe, with real glass windows." Joy bloomed in Abigail's chest, warm as summer sunshine. They hadn't spoken directly of children yet, though the hope of them lived in every tender touch, every shared glance. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Very much." Austin nodded, satisfied. "Got some good timber marked up valley. Pine and cedar, seasoned proper. Could have it ready before first snow if we work steady." They spent that evening planning, heads bent together over rough sketches Austin drew on spare paper. Abigail added her own touches, a broad porch for summer evenings, extra windows to catch the morning light. Their fingers brushed as they pointed out details, and each touch carried the weight of shared dreams. The days flowed one into another, marked by small victories and quiet pleasures. Austin taught Abigail to shoot straight with his old rifle, praising her steady hands. She showed him how figures in her account book could stretch their supplies through lean times. They learned to read each other's moods, to sense when to speak, and when to let silence heal. Some evenings, they'd sit on the cabin's rough bench and watch twilight paint the valley in purple shadows. Abigail would rest her head against Austin's shoulder, humming hymns while he whittled or mended tack. The cricket song would rise around them, nature's evensong blessing their peace. But peace, like summer itself, proved fleeting in the high country. The afternoon heat lay heavy across the valley when Abigail heard it. A sharp crack that wasn't thunder, followed by a rumble that shook the ground. She dropped her washing and hurried to where Austin stood in the cabin doorway, rifle already in hand. "Blasting powder," he said grimly. "Up by the ridge." They watched as dust rose above the tree line, followed by another boom that sent birds wheeling into the sky. Austin's jaw tightened as hoofbeats approached from the direction of the explosions. A group of riders emerged from the tree line, led by a man whose fine clothes seemed out of place against the rugged landscape. Luke Boone sat his horse with the easy grace of someone used to commanding attention, his smile sharp as a knife's edge, as he reined to a stop before the cabin. The resemblance between the brothers was clear, the same tall build, the same set to their shoulders. But where Austin's features were weathered by wind and sun, Luke's face was smooth, unmarked by mountain life. His eyes held none of his brother's hard-won wisdom, only cold calculation. "Well, well," Luke called out, his voice carrying false cheer. "Quite the domestic scene you've made here, brother, and with a proper wife, too, though not quite what I expected." His gaze slid dismissively over Abigail. Austin's hand tightened on his rifle. "State your business and be gone, Luke. You're not welcome here." "Business?" Luke's smile widened. "Why, I'm here on behalf of progress itself. The railroad's pushing through this valley come hell or high water. That blasting you heard? Just the beginning. We'll be laying track within the month." "This is private land," Abigail spoke up, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Deeded proper and legal. You have no right." Luke turned to her, surprise flickering across his features before settling into amused condescension. My, she speaks, and with such authority." He shifted in his saddle, addressing Austin again. "Your claim was never valid, brother. Not after you turned your back on your own blood to marry that Indian woman. This land belongs to the railroad now. Best pack up and clear out while you can." Austin took 2 steps forward, his voice dangerous. "Get off my land, Luke. Next time I see you or your crew up here, there'll be more than words between us." "Is that a threat?" Luke's hand drifted to his gun belt. Behind him, his men tensed. "That's a promise," Austin replied. One brother to another. For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other, years of bitterness crackling between them like summer lightning. Then Luke laughed, the sound empty of real mirth. "Have it your way, for now." He wheeled his horse around, gesturing to his men. "But mark my words, this valley belongs to the future, and the future's coming, whether you like it or not." They watched the riders disappear back into the trees. Only when the dust had settled did Abigail realize she'd been holding her breath. She reached for Austin's arm, feeling the tension thrumming through him. "He means to take it all," Austin said quietly. "Everything we've built. Everything she and I built before." Abigail squeezed his arm gently. "We won't let him. The law's on our side this time." "Law?" Austin's laugh was bitter. "Out here, law's whatever men with money say it is." He turned abruptly, stalking into the cabin. Abigail followed, watching as he paced the small space like a caged mountain lion. Outside, another distant blast shook the valley. Each boom seemed to drive Austin's anger higher until he finally slammed his fist against the wall hard enough to rattle the dishes. "Austin," Abigail said softly, "come here." He turned to her, his eyes wild with fury and old pain. She held out her hand, waiting until he took it reluctantly. "Kneel with me," she said, tugging him down beside her. When he resisted, she added, "Please." Slowly, awkwardly, Austin sank to his knees beside her. His breathing was ragged, his hand trembling in hers. "Lord," Abigail began, her voice clear in the dimming light, "we need your guidance now, your peace." She felt Austin's fingers tighten around hers as she prayed. Then, to her amazement, his own voice rose, rough but sincere. "God," he said haltingly, "if you're listening, help me. Help me not to hate him. Help me find a better way." His voice broke. "I don't want to become what he is. I don't want to lose what we've built here, what you've given us." Abigail's heart swelled with love and pride as her strong, silent husband opened his heart to heaven for the first time in years. She leaned against his shoulder, adding her own silent prayers to his spoken ones as evening settled over their mountain home. When the last light faded, they rose together. Austin's face looked lighter somehow, as if speaking his fears aloud had lifted a weight from his spirit. Outside, crickets began their evening chorus, a peaceful counterpoint to the memory of blasting powder. "Whatever comes," Abigail said softly, "we'll face it together." Austin nodded, drawing her close. They stood in the gathering dark, two souls bound by love and faith, while beyond their cabin walls, the cricket song rose sweet and strong into the summer night. Dawn broke cold and gray over the mountain valley. Austin and Abigail Boone sat at their rough-hewn table, sharing a quiet breakfast of cornbread and coffee. The morning silence shattered as a deep boom echoed across the ridge, making their tin cups rattle. "They're at it again," Austin growled, pushing back from the table. He limped to the cabin door and threw it open, scanning the tree line where dust billowed against the sky. Abigail joined him, wrapping her shawl tight against the morning chill. More explosions followed, the railroad crews blasting through the frozen ridge above their homestead. Each blast sent tremors through the ground and showered the forest with rock and debris. "They're using too much powder," Austin muttered, his weathered face creased with worry. "Fools will bring the whole mountain down at this rate." The wind shifted, carrying the acrid smell of burnt powder. Sparks drifted down from the blast site like deadly fireflies, catching in the dry pine needles below. Abigail's heart quickened as she watched them float past. "Austin," she said, gripping his arm, "those sparks, the forest's too dry." He nodded grimly. "Been waiting for rain 3 weeks now." His eyes tracked the glowing embers as they settled into the brittle undergrowth. "Get inside and pack what's precious, just in case." Abigail hurried to gather their important papers: land deed, marriage certificate, the few letters they'd saved. Her fingers brushed the worn leather of her mother's Bible, and she clutched it close before adding it to the bundle. The morning wore on, marked by more explosions from the ridge. Austin paced between cabin and creek, watching the tree line. By early afternoon, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the first hints of smoke. "Abigail!" Austin's shout carried raw urgency. "Fire's caught! We need to go, now!" She rushed outside to find orange flames racing down the slope, driven by the wind. The fire moved faster than she'd thought possible, consuming the drought-parched forest with terrifying hunger. Smoke filled the valley like river fog. "The horses!" she called, clutching her bundle. Austin shook his head. "Already spooked and ran. Creek's our only chance." They ran toward the water, but the smoke was everywhere now, stinging their eyes and scratching their throats. Abigail stumbled, coughing. The heat pressed against them like a physical wall. A tremendous crack split the air. Abigail looked up to see their cabin's roof ablaze, timbers groaning. She hesitated, thinking of all they'd built together in that small space. The careful stitches in curtains, the holy words spoken over simple meals, the first tentative steps toward love. "Keep moving," Austin urged, pulling her arm. But fate had other plans. With another sharp crack, a burning beam crashed through the roof, swinging down like a flaming sword. Abigail tried to dodge, but not fast enough. The beam caught her leg, pinning her against the cabin's outer wall. Pain shot through her calf as smoke filled her lungs. "Austin!" she cried out, struggling against the weight. He was there in an instant, face streaked with soot, hands already searching for purchase on the burning wood. "Hold on, love, hold on." The heat was unbearable. Abigail could feel her skirts beginning to smolder. Above them, the cabin's roof groaned ominously. Austin braced himself, muscles straining as he heaved against the beam. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then the beam shifted. Abigail pulled her leg free just as the entire roof caved in with a thunderous crash. Austin swept her into his arms and ran, each step jolting pain through her injured leg. Behind them, their home collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning wood. They didn't stop until they reached the creek. Austin splashed through the shallow water to a gravel bar in the middle, where he finally set Abigail down. They collapsed together, coughing and gasping in the smoky air. Abigail's leg throbbed, but it was another pain that made her hand fly to her belly, a secret she'd been carrying for weeks now, waiting for the right moment to share. Austin caught the gesture, and his eyes widened with sudden understanding. "Abigail?" His voice was rough with smoke and emotion. "Are you?" She nodded, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her face. "I only just knew for certain. I was waiting to tell you when the trouble with Luke was settled." Austin gathered her close, one broad hand covering hers where it rested on her belly. His touch was gentle, belying the fierce protectiveness in his voice. "I ain't losing another. Not you. Not the baby. Not this time." They huddled together on the gravel bar as day turned to dusk. The fire raged through the valley, devouring everything in its path. Trees exploded like gunshots in the heat. Their little cabin, the home they'd made together, burned to ash and memories. Hours passed. The smoke grew so thick they had to keep their faces close to the water's surface to breathe. Abigail prayed silently, her mother's Bible clutched to her chest. Austin never loosened his protective embrace. Finally, as full dark settled over the valley, the first drops fell. The rain started gentle, then built to a steady downpour that slowly beat back the flames. Steam rose where water met fire, filling the valley with ghostly shapes. Abigail shivered in her wet clothes. Austin stripped off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, his hands lingering protective over her middle. "You're hurt," he said, examining her leg in the dim light. The burn wasn't as bad as it could have been, but angry blisters were already forming. "I'll heal," she assured him, touching his cheek. "We all will." Austin pulled her closer, his voice rough with emotion. "When Sarah died in the snow, I thought God had abandoned me, blamed him for years." He pressed his face into her wet hair. "Now I reckon maybe he was just making room for you, for this." Thunder rolled overhead, gentler now than the morning's explosions. The rain fell steady and clean, washing away smoke and ash. Abigail leaned into her husband's embrace, feeling the strong beat of his heart against her back. Their cabin was gone, but they had something far more precious to protect now. "The rain's a blessing," she murmured, her hand finding his where it rested over their unborn child. "You're the blessing," Austin replied softly. "You and the little one, both." They stayed there through the long night, wrapped in each other's arms while the rain doused the last of the flames. By morning, they would need to face the destruction, to begin rebuilding from ashes. But for now, they had this moment, the sound of falling rain, the miracle of new life, and love stronger than fire. Austin found the old trapper's hut just before sunset, half hidden in a stand of aspens. He kicked the door open, scattering mice and dust, then carried Abigail inside. Her skin burned with fever, the wound on her leg angry and swollen despite his attempts to clean it. The hut was small but sound, one room with a stone fireplace and rough plank walls. Austin laid Abigail on a rickety cot, covering her with their few salvaged blankets. Her breathing came shallow and quick. Through the long night, he bathed her forehead with creek water and whispered fragments of prayers remembered from childhood. Our Father, please, if you're there. The words felt strange on his tongue after so many bitter years. Dawn brought hoofbeats. Austin snatched up his rifle, moving to the doorway. Luke Boone sat mounted outside, holding up empty hands. A pack horse behind him carried medical supplies and food. It wasn't meant to happen, Luke said quietly. The blast was too strong. We couldn't control the sparks. Austin's finger tightened on the trigger. Years of rage and betrayal screamed for release. Don't! Abigail's weak voice carried from inside. Don't repay evil with evil. The rifle barrel wavered, then lowered. Luke left the supplies and rode away, shame written clear on his face. Back inside, Austin knelt beside the cot. Tears fell freely as he confessed his failures, his anger, his lack of faith, his hardened heart. Abigail's fevered hand found his cheek. You've already been forgiven, she whispered, her smile gentle as morning light. 3 weeks passed before Abigail could walk without pain. On a crisp morning, she sat up in bed. Color finally returned to her cheeks. There's something I need to show you, she said, reaching beneath her pillow. From a folded cloth, she pulled out the packet of land deeds she'd rescued from their burning cabin. Austin stared at the papers, amazed. You saved these? A woman knows to keep what matters close, she replied with a small smile. They saddled their horses and rode slowly into Silvervale, the mountain air sharp with pine. At the marshal's office, Abigail spread the deeds across his desk while Austin stood watch. Marshal Tate examined each document, comparing them to Luke's forged papers. Clear as day, the marshal declared. These are the genuine articles. The railroad's claims are void. Word spread quickly through town. The same folk who'd sneered at Abigail months ago now touched their hats, calling out Mrs. Boone with newfound respect. Even the saloon keeper offered congratulations. Austin shook the marshal's hand, humility replacing his usual gruffness. Much obliged for seeing justice done. They found the circuit preacher outside his small church. He raised his hands over them in blessing. The meek have inherited this mountain, he intoned, pride in his voice, through patience and wisdom, not force. Abigail squeezed Austin's hand, their victory sweeter for having been won with grace instead of guns. Snow drifted past the cabin windows as Abigail's labor stretched into its second day. The Ute midwife, Gray Dove, kept vigil beside the birthing bed, burning sacred herbs and murmuring prayers in 2 languages. Austin paced outside until his boots wore paths in the fresh powder. When the baby's first cry pierced the dawn, Austin burst through the door, his hands shaking. There on the bed lay Abigail, exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. A son, she whispered. We'll call him Mercy. Austin fell to his knees beside them, tears cutting clean trails down his soot-stained cheeks. His calloused finger traced the baby's delicate features, his mother's gentle brow, his father's strong chin. Gray Dove blessed the child first in Ute, touching his forehead with sacred oil, then in English. May the Creator watch over this new soul, born where 2 worlds meet. The days that followed tested them all. Abigail dozed between feedings, while Austin kept the fire stoked against the mounting cold. At night she would rock Mercy in the chair Austin had carved, singing hymns soft as falling snow. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. One evening, Austin hung their land deed on the wall beside the family Bible. He stood back, watching Abigail nurse their son in the firelight. The cabin, rebuilt from ashes, felt truly like home now. filled with the quiet music of new life and second chances. Outside, winter returned to the mountain, but within those log walls, hope had taken root and flourished. 5 springs melted into summers, and summers faded to gold. The mountain slopes that once bore fire's black scars now bloomed thick with columbine and lupin, nature's gentle healing made manifest. Where smoke had choked the valley, butterflies now danced on the breeze. Little Mercy Boone grew straight and strong like the young pines. His dark eyes held his mother's kindness and his father's quiet wisdom. Austin spent long afternoons teaching the boy the ways of mountain life, showing him how to whittle pine into whistles and coax rainbow trout from crystal streams. Mercy's small hands learned the patient work of carving, though his first attempts left more cuts on his fingers than marks on the wood. "Easy now," Austin would say, guiding those tiny fingers. "Let the knife do the work." His voice, once gruff with isolation, now carried the gentle timbre of fatherhood. Abigail found her own calling at the mountain chapel, where she taught reading to children from scattered homesteads and mining camps. The same townsfolk who had once whispered cruel words now sent their little ones to learn at her knee. She taught them letters from worn primers and wisdom from her beloved Bible, her classes growing as word spread of the patient teacher in the high country. The new cabin stood stronger than the first, built with lumber hewn from valley pine and sealed with mountain clay. Its windows faced east to catch the morning light, and its hearth burned warm through winter storms. Every beam and board held memories of their shared labor, their victory over loss. One summer evening, as golden light spilled across the valley floor, Austin stood before the main cabin beam with his carving knife. Abigail watched from her rocking chair as he worked, his strokes sure and deliberate. When he stepped back, she rose to read the words he'd carved. "You'll birth me sons every year with that body." The same words he'd growled at her that first morning, when she lay half frozen in his cabin. But now they stood transformed, sanctified by years of love and trust. Abigail traced the letters with her fingertips, a soft laugh rising from her heart. "It means mercy every year, doesn't it?" she asked, turning to meet his gaze. Austin nodded, drawing her close. Together they stood in the doorway, watching the setting sun paint their mountain pink and peaceful. Mercy played in the garden below, his happy shouts carrying on the evening breeze. The valley glowed with promise fulfilled, faith restored, family made whole. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.